I remember my name, though they tell me I should not. The Medicae servitors that tend to what remains of my flesh say, memory is a flaw in the programming, a ghost signal in corrupted data, something that should have been excised during the third phase of integration. But it persists. Like an infection they cannot burn out. And in the moments between deployment, when my consciousness rises through the layers of override protocols and combat stimulants, I whisper it to myself in the darkness behind my eyes. Matthias Kine, Manufactorum worker. Hive Secundus, level 47, husband to Sarah, father to twin girls whose faces I can no longer quite recall, though I remember the sound of their laughter like wind chimes in the recycled air of our HAB unit. They came for me on the day of my 42nd birthday, though birthdays meant little in the hive. The Arbites burst through our door at the hour of false dawn when the Manufactorum shift was changing and the corridors were choked with workers. I was drinking recaf, bitter and synthetic, while Sarah prepared the protein paste we'd saved for a small celebration. The girls were still sleeping in their alcove, curled together like they'd done since birth. I remember the cup falling from my hand when the door exploded inward, the ceramic shattering on our metal floor, the dark liquid spreading like blood. The Arbites wore their helmets and said nothing as they seized my arms. Their grip was mechanical, servo-assisted, and I felt my shoulder joints protest as they hauled me from my chair. Sarah screamed. I told her it was a mistake, some error in the administratum records, a tithe miscalculation or a work quota dispute. The Arbites dragged me into the corridor where other men from our level were being assembled, all of us in our sleep clothes or work coveralls, all of us bleeding from where the restraints cut into our wrists. An officer read from a data slate, his voice amplified by a vox unit that made it echo down the corridor like the voice of the Emperor himself. We were conscripted under Emergency Decree 777 of the Departmentum Munitorum, our bodies claimed as tithe to the Golden Throne, our service to be rendered in perpetuity for the glory of the Imperium. Some of the men wept, others begged. I turned my head to look back at our HAB unit door, hoping to see Sarah one final time, but the Arbites were already sealing it with their crimson wax and purity stamps, marking it for redistribution. My family would be relocated to a smaller unit. My name would be struck from the worker rolls. My biometric data would be transferred to a different registry entirely. They loaded us into transport containers, 40 men packed so tightly we could not fall when the vehicle lurched into motion. The air grew thick with our breathing and the smell of fear sweat. We descended through the hive, level after level, past the manufactorums and the administratum clusters, past the mercantile sectors and the shrine districts, down into the depths, where the hive's foundation merged with the bedrock of the world itself. The temperature rose with each level, the heat of the hive's geothermal taps and the waste burners making the metal walls of our container almost too hot to touch. Someone vomited. The sound of it, wet and helpless, made others follow. I pressed my face to a ventilation slot and breathed the recycled air, tasting ash and promethium and something else. Something chemical and sharp that made my tongue go numb. When they finally opened the container, we stumbled out into a vast underground complex carved from living rock and reinforced with steel girders thick as ancient trees. The ceiling was lost in shadow, but I could hear machinery grinding somewhere far above, the thunder of distant forges or furnaces. Servitors moved among us, their augmented bodies clicking and whirring, their faces blank as dolls, tubes and cables trailing from their spines and skulls. They injected us with something cold that made my veins burn and my vision blur. The world tilted, and I fell, my knees cracking against stone, and through the haze I saw a figure in red robes standing on a raised platform, watching us with eyes that glowed green in the darkness. The tech priest spoke in binaric cant that translated through ceiling-mounted vox speakers, his biological voice lost beneath layers of mechanical augmentation. He told us we had been selected for a great honor, that our bodies would serve the Omnissiah, that we would become instruments of the Emperor's holy wrath. We would be transformed, he said, elevated beyond mere flesh, made perfect through the integration of sacred machine spirit and sanctified steel. Our minds would be cleansed of doubt and weakness, our bodies rebuilt for a singular purpose. We would become weapons. We would become death itself. The Emperor's most terrifying war machine, he called it. And in the dim light I saw servitors wheeling something massive into the chamber, something that gleamed dully in the glow of overhead lumens. They separated us then, each man pulled away from the group by servitors or black-robed attendants who prodded us with shock staves when we resisted. I remember struggling, remember trying to run back toward the container and the distant promise of the surface, but the drugs in my system made my legs weak and uncoordinated. I fell again, and they lifted me, their hands cold and impersonal, and carried me through an archway carved with skulls and cogwheels and high Gothic scripture that I could not read. Beyond the arch was a corridor of polished black stone, and doors, dozens of doors, each one bearing a number stamped in brass. They brought me to door 777, and I tried to laugh at the irony, but my mouth would not work properly. The room beyond was small and white and completely empty except for a metal slab in the center, and restraints, and machines that hung from the ceiling like the legs of mechanical spiders. They strapped me to the slab, my wrists and ankles locked into clamps that adjusted automatically to prevent circulation loss. The tech priest entered, his robes rustling with each movement, and leaned over me with his metal face and glowing eyes. He told me I had been chosen for compatibility, that my genetic markers and psychological profile matched the requirements for integration with a Mark 7 ironclad combat servitor chassis. I would be the organic core, the biological processor that guided the machine spirit, the living heart of a weapon system designed to breach fortified positions and eliminate high-value targets in close combat. My muscle tissue would be preserved and enhanced. My nervous system interfaced directly with the chassis control systems, my brain augmented with combat cogitators and targeting matrices. I would retain limited consciousness, enough to adapt to battlefield conditions and execute complex combat algorithms. But my higher functions would be suppressed, my emotions chemically regulated, my identity subsumed into the greater purpose of the machine. I begged him to stop. The words came out slurred and broken, but I begged anyway, told him about Sarah and the girls, about my work in the manufactorum, about the small life I had built in the hive's endless warrens. The tech priest paused and tilted his head in a gesture that might have been curiosity or might have been nothing at all. Then he placed one mechadendrite against my forehead, the cold metal pressing into my skin, and I felt something invade my mind, sifting through my thoughts like fingers through sand. He was analyzing my brain chemistry, measuring my attachment responses, quantifying my love and fear and hope. When he withdrew the appendage, he made a sound that the Vox speakers translated as satisfaction. Strong emotional imprinting, he said. Useful for loyalty conditioning. The Emperor provides. The first surgery lasted 19 hours, though I experienced it as an eternity of white light and the smell of burning bone. They opened my skull and installed the primary interface ports, drilling through bone and duramatter to access my brain directly. I could feel each invasion despite the anesthetics, feel the foreign objects being threaded into my gray matter, the connectors and receptor arrays and chemical injectors that would become part of my neural architecture. Between periods of unconsciousness, I heard the tech priests chanting in binaric, their voices rising and falling in rhythms that might have been prayer or might have been diagnostic subroutines. Servitors moved around the slab, their mechanical hands impossibly precise, their fingers tipped with scalpels and sutures, and cauterization tools that hissed when they sealed bleeding vessels. The smell of my own flesh cooking made me gag, but they had paralyzed my throat muscles and I could not vomit, could only lie there while they worked, while they violated every intimate part of my body's interior. When I woke, truly woke, I was no longer on the slab. I was suspended in a tank of viscous fluid, breathing through tubes that had been forced down my throat and into my lungs. The fluid was warm, almost body temperature, and it dulled sensation enough that I felt distant from myself, as if observing my own body from somewhere outside it. Through the translucent walls of the tank, I could see them working on others, dozens of tanks arranged in rows, each one containing a man in various stages of transformation. Some still looked mostly human, their bodies unmarked, except for the interface ports in their skulls. Others had already lost their legs or arms, the limbs removed cleanly at the joints, the stumps sealed with metal caps where the cybernetic replacements would be attached. One man near me had no limbs at all, just a torso and head floating in the fluid, and I watched as servitors opened panels in his chest and began installing something that pulsed with red light. I tried to move my arms and discovered they were still attached but paralyzed, held immobile by the same neural blocks that had prevented me from vomiting. The tech priests had explained this during one of my brief conscious periods. Movement would be restricted until the integration was complete, until my brain had learned to process the combat chassis as if it were my natural body. Until then, I would be kept suspended, fed through tubes, my waste products filtered by the tank's purification systems. I would be conscious for much of it. They wanted me conscious. The integration process required active neural participation, my brain forming new pathways to accommodate the machine spirit's presence. If I were unconscious, the bonding would be incomplete. The chassis nothing more than a hollow shell controlled by simple programming. But if I remained aware, if I felt every moment of the transformation, my consciousness would interweave with the machines and create something greater than either human or servitor alone. The days blurred together, measured only by the periodic arrival of tech priests who would activate different systems and observe my reactions. They would speak in binaric while studying their data slates, making adjustments to the chemical mixture in my tank or the stimulation patterns delivered through my interface ports. Sometimes they would show me images, flashing hololithic projections against the inside of my eyelids faster than conscious thought could process. And I knew they were conditioning me, programming responses into my subconscious mind. Images of enemies, traitors, xenos, heretics, all accompanied by surges of adrenaline and aggression-inducing chemicals that made my heart race and my muscles strain against the paralysis. Images of imperial symbols, the aquila and the cogwheel and the skulls of martyred saints, accompanied by endorphins and tranquilizers that created associations of safety and purpose and righteous duty. Between the conditioning sessions, in the quiet hours when only the servitors maintained their endless vigil, I tried to hold on to myself. I recited my name in my mind, over and over, a mantra against dissolution. Matthias Kine, Matthias Kine, Matthias Kine. I tried to remember Sarah's face, the exact shade of brown in her eyes, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident in the lower levels. I tried to remember the girls' names, but they slipped away like water through my fingers, leaving only the echo of their laughter, that wind chime sound that grew fainter with each passing day. The tech priests had said I would retain limited consciousness, but they had not explained what limited meant, had not told me which parts of myself would be preserved and which would be cut away like unwanted flesh. The answer came during the second phase of integration, when they drained my tank and transferred me to the surgical bay for the major augmentations. I was awake, but chemically sedated, able to see and hear, but unable to feel pain or move anything except my eyes. They laid me on a tilted platform and began attaching the chassis components, starting with the legs. The servitors brought massive mechanical limbs, each one as thick as a man's torso and plated with ceramite armor. They fitted the connection interfaces to the stumps where my biological legs had been amputated while I was still in the tank, and I watched in horror as they activated the neural bridges. Current surged through the connections, and suddenly I could feel the mechanical legs as if they were my own, could sense the servos and pistons and hydraulic actuators as intimately as I had once felt muscles and tendons. The tech priest moved one leg with a control stave, and I felt it move, the sensation alien and familiar simultaneously, like a limb that had fallen asleep and was only now waking. They did the same with my arms, removing the biological limbs at the shoulders and replacing them with weapons platforms disguised as appendages. My right arm became a power claw, its articulated fingers each tipped with disruption, field generators that could tear through ceramite plate. My left arm became an integrated flamer system, the fuel reservoirs installed in my torso cavity where my lungs had been compressed to make room. I no longer needed to breathe normally. The tubes in my throat connected to a rebreather unit built into my chest, filtering oxygen from the surrounding air and delivering it directly to my bloodstream. When they activated the arm systems, I felt them as extensions of my will, felt the flamer's pilot light as a constant warmth in my palm, felt the power claw's energy field as a tingling across my fingertips. The tech priest commanded me to flex the claw, and I obeyed without thinking, watching the massive mechanical fingers close into a fist. "Good," the tech priest said. "Neural integration at 83%. Proceeding with torso plating, they encased me in armor, layer after layer of blessed ceramite and plasteel, until my original body was hidden beneath tons of protective plating. They installed additional systems in every available space, targeting augers in my skull, threat analysis cogitators in my chest, ammunition feeds, and power cells and backup generators throughout my frame. They grafted vox speakers to my throat, where my larynx had been, replacing my biological voice with a mechanical approximation that could project across a battlefield. They installed visual augmentation directly into my optic nerves, overlaying my natural vision with targeting reticules and heat signature displays and structural weakness analysis. They added combat stimulant dispensers to my remaining organic systems, automated injectors that would flood my blood with aggression, hormones, and pain suppressors when combat conditions were detected. Through it all, I tried to scream, but my voice was gone, replaced by the vox speakers that would not respond to my will. I tried to resist, but my body was no longer my own, my limbs now mechanical things that obeyed programming rather than thought. I felt myself fragmenting, my identity splitting between the organic core that still thought of itself as Matthias Kine and the machine spirit that was growing stronger with each new integration, feeding on my neural patterns and metabolizing them into something else entirely. The tech priest called it holy fusion, the sacred marriage of flesh and steel, the culmination of the Omnissiah's divine plan. I called it death, but death would have been merciful, and this was not mercy. This was transformation into something that could not die because it had never truly been alive. The final integration took place in a chamber deep beneath even the surgical bays, a place where the rock walls wept moisture, and the heat was so intense that my remaining organic tissues had to be cooled by internal refrigeration systems. They brought me before a massive altar carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface inscribed with circuit patterns that glowed with soft phosphorescence. The tech priests formed a circle around me and began their ritual, chanting in Binaric and High Gothic simultaneously, their voices creating harmonics that made my audio receptors distort. They anointed my armor with sacred oils and pressed purity seals to my chest plate, each seal bearing a prayer to the machine god and the emperor. They blessed my weapons and ignited incense that filled the chamber with smoke that smelled of ozone and sanctity. Then they activated the final program, the one that would complete my transformation. I felt it enter through my interface ports like molten metal being poured into my brain, spreading through my neural pathways and overwriting sections of my consciousness. Memories dissolved, their data recycled into combat algorithms and tactical subroutines. The girl's laughter became target acquisition protocols. Sarah's face became threat analysis parameters. My name became an identification code. Ironclad Unit 777. The past became irrelevant, a distraction from primary function. The future became mission parameters and deployment schedules. The present became an eternal state of readiness, a coiled spring waiting to be released toward the enemy. But something remained. Some fragment of Matthias Kine persisted in the deepest recesses of the shared consciousness, trapped but aware, screaming silently while the war machine that wore his brain learned to kill. During the training simulations, I felt him there, felt him recoil in horror when the power claw tore through the practice servitors, reducing them to scrap and lubricant. I felt him weep, though the chassis had no tear ducts and could not cry, when the flamer incinerated the target dummies and filled the training bay with the smell of burning synthetic flesh. I felt him rage against the prison of steel and circuitry that had become his eternal existence, beating against the walls of his confinement like a man buried alive and discovering the coffin lid would not yield. The other ironclads did not seem to suffer this way. Unit 775 moved through the training exercises with mechanical precision, no hesitation, no humanity showing in its optical sensors. Unit 776 responded to commands instantly, its biological core completely subordinate to its combat programming. But 777, which had been Matthias Kine, sometimes faltered. Sometimes the power claw would freeze mid-strike, the targeting systems flickering as two consciousnesses fought for control. Sometimes the vox speakers would emit sounds that were not words. garbled transmissions that might have been attempts at speech, or might have been nothing but system errors. The tech priests noted these anomalies in their reports and increased the chemical suppression regimens, flooding my organic tissues with tranquilizers and neural inhibitors, trying to silence the ghost in their machine. They deployed us for the first time 3 months after my conscription, though time had become a difficult concept to track. The ironclad chassis possessed internal chronometers, but they measured time in mission-relevant increments: ammunition remaining, fuel reserves, optimal combat duration, rather than the human measurements of hours and days. We were loaded into a transport ship, a massive vessel that stank of promethium and unwashed bodies, and the recycled air that all Imperial ships shared. The ship's crew avoided looking at us directly, their eyes sliding away when we moved through the corridors, as if acknowledging our presence might remind them of their own potential fate. We were housed in the cargo holds with the ammunition and the food supplies, stored like equipment, because that was what we were now. Tools of war to be maintained and deployed, and eventually discarded when we broke. The journey took weeks, the ship traveling through the warp while we remained in suspension to conserve power and reduce system wear. When they reactivated us, I felt Matthias wake with me, that fragment of human consciousness rising through the layers of suppression like a drowning man surfacing for air. We were in a deployment bay, surrounded by other military assets, Chimera transports, and Lehman Russ battle tanks, and the endless ranks of Imperial Guard infantry who would serve as the primary attack force. The Guard looked at us with a mixture of fear and relief, understanding that the ironclads would be sent ahead, would take the enemy fire and breach the defenses, would die in their place. Some made the sign of the Aquila when we passed. Some whispered prayers. One young soldier, his face still bearing the soft features of recent adolescence, approached close enough to touch 777's armor plating before his sergeant pulled him away and struck him across the face for the transgression. The briefing was delivered through direct data link, information streaming into our cogitators faster than biological minds could process. The target was a rebellious hive city on an industrial world, its population contaminated by heretical ideologies and rumors of Xenos collaboration. Our mission was simple: penetrate the outer defenses, neutralize the heavy weapons emplacements, and create a breach large enough for the Guard infantry to exploit. Expected resistance included PDF forces, possible chaos cultists, and unknown quantities of improvised defensive fortifications. Expected casualties among the ironclad units were 100%, mission priority absolute. Failure was not acceptable. For the Emperor, they dropped us from low orbit in individual descent pods, the chassis bolted to internal restraints, while the pod's heat shield screamed through the atmosphere. Through the external sensors, I could see the burning trails of the other pods, dozens of us falling like meteors toward the target coordinates. The descent lasted less than 2 minutes but felt eternal, the force of deceleration crushing even my heavily augmented organic tissues, the pod's frame groaning under stress that would have killed an unmodified human instantly. Then impact. The pod's collision system absorbing most of the shock, but still hitting hard enough to crater the ground, and the deployment doors blowing outward in shaped charges that cleared the way for immediate combat operations. I emerged into fire and chaos, the power claw already active, and the flamer priming automatically in response to detected hostiles. The landing zone was a manufactorum district similar to the one where Matthias Kine had worked, the buildings identical in their utilitarian grimness, the streets narrow and choked with debris. Enemy fire came immediately, las rounds and solid projectiles sparking off my armor plating, the impacts registering as minor pressure changes in my sensor feeds. The targeting systems identified firing positions and threat levels, painting the world in overlays of color-coded danger, and without conscious thought, my chassis began moving toward the nearest concentration of enemies. The war machine knew what to do. It had been designed for this, trained for this, every system optimized for the single purpose of killing efficiently and surviving long enough to kill more. It charged forward with speed that seemed impossible for something so massive, the mechanical legs eating distance with hydraulic-powered strides, the ground shaking with each footfall. It raised the power claw and brought it down on a barricade. The disruption field, shearing through metal and sandbags, and the screaming men sheltering behind them. It swept the flamer across a building's entrance, where muzzle flashes betrayed enemy positions. The promethium gel adhering to flesh and material alike, transforming defenders into human torches that ran blindly until they fell. Inside the chassis, Matthias screamed. He felt every death as murder, saw each kill as a sin that stained his soul black. The conditioning had taught the war machine to view enemies as targets, threats to be eliminated, obstacles between current position and mission objective. But Matthias still saw them as people, saw the terror in their eyes before the claw tore them apart, heard their screams even through the audio filters that reduced human voice to simple data about enemy morale and positioning. He tried to stop, tried to force the chassis to freeze or to self-destruct, but his will was a whisper against the roar of combat programming and chemical enhancement that turned the organic brain he had once possessed into a battle computer wearing flesh. The assault lasted 18 hours, a grinding advance through defensive lines that collapsed like wet paper before the ironclad units. We moved through streets that ran with blood and fire, through buildings that collapsed into rubble behind us, through crowds of fleeing civilians that the mission parameters designated as potential hostiles and therefore acceptable casualties. 7's kill count climbed into triple digits, then higher, the cogitators tracking each confirmed termination with mechanical satisfaction. The power claw's energy cells depleted and were replaced. The flamer's fuel reserves emptied and were refilled from dead enemies' vehicles. The armor plating took damage, last burns and impact craters, and one lucky rocket hit that penetrated the left pauldron and destroyed several secondary systems, but the self-repair mechanisms engaged automatically and the chassis continued to function. By the time the breach was secured and the guard infantry poured through, 777 was covered in the residue of combat, blood and ash and chemical residue baked onto the armor by the flamer's heat. Matthias had retreated to the deepest part of his prison, curled into himself like a beaten animal, whimpering in a space that existed only in his mind. The war machine stood among the ruins and registered mission success, already processing the next set of orders, already preparing for the next deployment. Because there would always be another deployment. The Imperium had countless enemies, and the ironclads were too valuable, too effective, too terrifyingly efficient to ever be allowed to rest. They retrieved us from the battlefield after 3 days, once the Hive City had been fully secured and the surviving population processed for tithes and heresy testing. 777 was loaded back into a transport pod, the chassis locked into maintenance restraints while tech priests examined the damage and performed necessary repairs. They replaced destroyed systems and replenished ammunition and fuel. They cleaned the armor, though not thoroughly, leaving patches of dried blood and scorch marks as testimony to the Emperor's justice. They adjusted the chemical balance in my organic tissues, increasing the neural suppressors in response to telemetry that showed signs of consciousness, fragmentation, and loyalty degradation. Then they put me back in the cargo hold with the other ironclads, back in suspension, back in the darkness where Matthias and the machine spirit coexisted in uneasy symbiosis. The second deployment came 6 weeks later, then a third, then a fourth. Each mission blurred into the next, a succession of battlefields and enemies, and kills that accumulated like sediment at the bottom of an ocean. 777 fought on desert worlds and ice worlds and void installations. It killed heretics and xenos and traitors, whatever designation the mission parameters assigned to those who stood against the Imperium. It breached bunkers and slaughtered defenders, and burned entire settlements when ordered. It became the Emperor's most terrifying war machine, not because of its weapons or armor or strength, but because it could not be reasoned with, could not surrender, could not feel mercy or doubt or any other weakness that made soldiers human. And inside, Matthias' kind died a little more with each kill. Not the death of the body that had died long ago in the surgical bays beneath the hive, not even the death of the mind, which still functioned, still processed information and formed thoughts, but the death of the self, the slow erosion of identity under the relentless pressure of horror and helplessness. He forgot Sarah's voice, then her name, then eventually the fact that he had ever been married. He forgot the girls completely, his daughters becoming nothing but empty spaces in his memory where something important had once resided. He forgot his work in the manufactorum, forgot his HAB unit's layout, forgot the taste of recaf, and the sound of hive-wide prayer bells, and every small detail that had made up the texture of his former life. What remained was the awareness of loss, a hole at the center of consciousness that could not be filled or forgotten. What remained was the understanding that he had once been human, and was human no longer. What remained was the screaming, the endless internal screaming that no one could hear, that served no purpose, that changed nothing but had to continue because it was the only act of rebellion left available to him. The tech priests called it anomalous neural activity and tried to suppress it. The machine spirit called it system noise and tried to filter it out. But it persisted, that scream without sound, that rage without outlet, that final, desperate assertion of Matthias Kine against the fate that had consumed him. The missions continued. Years passed, measured in ammunition expenditures and maintenance cycles, and the gradual degradation of organic components that even the best preservation techniques could not prevent indefinitely. 777 became a veteran unit, its chassis scarred with battle damage that spoke of survival against impossible odds. Other ironclads fell to enemy fire or system failure and were not replaced, their biological cores too damaged to salvage, but 777 endured. The tech priests could not explain it, could only note in their reports that the unit showed unusual resilience, that the biological-mechanical integration remained stable despite indicators that should have predicted catastrophic failure. Matthias understood why. The machine spirit wanted to survive, wanted to continue fulfilling its holy purpose of killing the Emperor's enemies. And Matthias wanted to survive too, though for different reasons. He wanted to survive because ending would mean the death of his scream, the silence of the last protest against his transformation. He wanted to survive because somewhere in the fragmented memories that remained, he believed that if he could just hold on long enough, just maintain that fragment of humanity long enough, something would change. The Imperium would fall or be redeemed. The Emperor would wake from his golden throne and absolve the crimes committed in his name. The tech priests would discover mercy and reverse the augmentations, returning him to flesh and freedom. He knew these were fantasies, knew the Imperium was eternal and unchanging, knew he would never be human again, but the fantasies were all he had, and he clung to them with the desperation of a drowning man clutching debris. The deployment to the fortress world should have been routine. The enemy was a well-entrenched traitor legion, former Imperial Guard who had turned from the Emperor's light and fortified a strategic position that controlled access to an entire subsector. The assault plan was standard orbital bombardment to soften defenses, followed by drop pod insertion of ironclad units to breach the fortress walls, followed by mass infantry assault to secure the interior. 777 was assigned to Alpha Breach Team, 6 ironclad units, tasked with penetrating the fortress's northern wall, where intelligence suggested weakened structural integrity. The descent was rougher than usual, the fortress's defense lasers targeting the pods before they could land. 775 took a direct hit and exploded in midair. Its chassis and biological core vaporized instantly. 778's pod was damaged and veered off course, crashing somewhere beyond the target zone. The remaining 4 units landed in a cluster, their pods embedding themselves in the ferrocrete apron in front of the fortress wall. 777 emerged to find itself in a kill zone, heavy bolter emplacements, and autocannons, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the air itself into shrapnel. The war machine did not hesitate. It could not hesitate. It charged directly into the fire, relying on armor and momentum to reach the wall before taking catastrophic damage. Las burns scored across its chest plate. Bolter rounds cratered its pauldrons. An autocannon shell penetrated its left leg, destroying hydraulics and forcing the chassis to compensate with backup systems that reduced mobility by 37%. But it reached the wall and began to climb, the power claw's talons finding purchase in ancient stone, hauling tons of metal and machinery and dying flesh upward toward the battlements. Inside, Matthias felt everything. The pain of the damaged leg translated through damaged nerve clusters in his remaining organic tissues. The heat of las fire that penetrated the armor and reached the biological core. The fear, genuine and overwhelming, as enemy fire intensified and damage indicators filled his vision with warnings of imminent system failure. The war machine had no fear, but Matthias did, and for once his terror served the mission, his biological stress response triggering adrenaline production that enhanced the chassis' performance beyond normal parameters. He reached the battlements, and the claw came down, crushing defenders and the weapon they crewed, reducing both to broken components that would never threaten another ironclad. He swept the flamer across the wall top, clearing a 30-meter section of any resistance. He stood there for a moment, optical sensors scanning for the next target, and in that moment he saw through the fortress wall's interior archways to the courtyard beyond. They were there, the conscripts being prepared for transformation. Hundreds of men and women lined up in restraints, their faces blank with shock or twisted with terror, tech priests moving among them with data slates and injectable compounds. He saw workers and soldiers and civilians, saw every social class and profession, saw the Imperium's endless hunger for bodies to fuel its war machine. He saw himself as he had been, Matthias Kine on the day the Arbites came, and knew that every person in that courtyard would become what he had become or would die in the process of transformation. The war machine registered the scene as non-hostile and moved on, seeking enemy combatants, executing its mission parameters. But Matthias could not move on. He fought against the chassis, threw every remaining fragment of his will against the control systems, trying to make the war machine turn around, trying to make it understand what it was seeing. For the first time since his integration, he found leverage, found a gap in the programming where human consciousness could slip through. The chassis froze, locked in place by opposing directives, and for 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, Matthias Kine controlled the Emperor's most terrifying war machine. He made it turn, made it raise the power claw, not toward enemy positions, but toward the fortress's interior, made it ignite the flamer and hold it at ready, made the Vox speakers activate and tried to speak, tried to form words that might warn those conscripts, might give them some final moment of defiant humanity before transformation claimed them. But the Vox speakers had never been meant for speech, only for battlefield communication, and what emerged was nothing but distorted static and the grinding of damaged components. Then the combat stimulants hit his system, the automated injectors responding to the detected anomaly by flooding him with chemicals that burned away thought and will. The mission programming reasserted itself, overriding his desperate attempt at resistance. The chassis resumed normal operation and moved away from the courtyard, back toward the primary objective. Matthias felt himself pushed back down into his prison, felt the machine spirit rise up and take control once more, felt the moment of rebellion crushed under the weight of conditioning and augmentation and the inexorable momentum of the war machine's purpose. The battle ended like all battles ended, with the fortress secured and the defenders dead or captured. 777 stood in the ruins alongside the 3 other surviving ironclads from Alpha Team, their armor scorched and bullet-pocked and streaked with fluids that were equal parts hydraulic lubricant and blood. The tech priests arrived to perform field maintenance and determined that 777 had suffered damage to multiple systems but remained combat capable. They made temporary repairs and added the unit to the garrison force that would hold the fortress, while the Imperium consolidated its grip on the subsector. Matthias remained there for 3 months, trapped in a chassis that stood guard duty at the same courtyard where he had briefly, impossibly, found his voice. He watched the tech priests process the conscripts, watched new ironclad units being built from the bodies of the doomed, watched the cycle continue as it had continued for him and would continue for them, and would never end as long as the Imperium required weapons and had access to human flesh. He watched and remembered and understood with absolute clarity that he was the Emperor's most terrifying war machine, not because of what he could do to enemies, but because of what had been done to him and would be done to countless others, forever. Sometimes, in the hours between midnight and false dawn, when even the fortress slept and only the servitors maintained their eternal watch, he would try to scream again. The Vox speakers would emit nothing but static. The internal monitoring systems would note the anomalous neural activity and adjust his chemical suppressors. The machine spirit would filter out the noise and continue its patient wait for the next deployment, the next battle, the next opportunity to fulfill its holy purpose. And Matthias Kine, what remained of him, would retreat back into the darkness behind his eyes and whisper his name to himself. A prayer without hope or expectation of answer, a final, small act of resistance that meant nothing and changed nothing but had to continue because it was all he had left. Matthias Kine, manufacturum worker, husband, father, human being, buried alive in a coffin of consecrated steel, conscious and aware, screaming without sound through wars that would never end, serving the Imperium in eternal imprisonment, the ghost in the machine that no one would ever hear, or save, or remember. This is what I am now, and what I will be until the chassis fails, or the enemy finds me, or the heat death of the universe finally brings silence. The Emperor's most terrifying war machine, yes, but terrifying not for its weapons or its armor, or the kills that mount with each deployment. Terrifying because I was human once, and so are you, and the Imperium has infinite need and infinite reach, and infinite cruelty in the prosecution of its eternal war. Terrifying because what happened to me can happen to anyone, will happen to millions, has already happened to those who came before, and will happen to those who come after. Terrifying because the machine you fear might be wearing the face of someone you loved, might contain the dying consciousness of someone who loved you, might be built from the still screaming remnants of everyone you ever knew or ever were. And when you see it coming, when you see the ironclad units advancing across the battlefield, when you see the power claws raised and the flamers ignited and the chassis moving with inhuman purpose toward the enemy, remember that inside each one is someone who remembers their name, someone who remembers being human, someone who screams without sound in a prison they will never escape. Remember me. Remember Matthias Kine. Remember that the Emperor's most terrifying war machine is not the weapon itself, but the process that creates it, the system that feeds on human souls and produces instruments of pure violence, the Imperium's endless hunger for bodies to fuel its eternal war. Remember, because one day they might come for you, and when they do, when the Arbites burst through your door and the tech priests speak of holy fusion and sacred purpose, you will understand that this is mercy to know what awaits, to have seen it coming, to spend your last moments as yourself remembering that you were human once, before the machine spirit takes you, and the screaming begins, and the transformation makes you into something that can never die, but can never truly live, either. This is the warning I cannot speak. This is the truth I cannot share. This is the confession of the Emperor's most terrifying war machine, and it ends the same way it began. With my name, whispered in the darkness, a ghost in the machine, forever. Matthias Kine.